OP09 had its first major event in Japan, with almost 2,000 players attending. In this video, we're going to be going over some of the deck lists that did very well in this tournament, as well as talking about the meta in general and how it's been evolving and starting to stabilize. Especially when there's a championship round, I want to be able to aggregate these winning deck lists and digest them in a way that's easy to present for you guys. Now, before we get into this video, I want to say that I'm doing my first giveaway ever. My channel has grown extremely fast, and as such, I really haven't had the timetable to say thank you to you guys. 5,000 is a very big milestone, and as such, I wanted to kind of do something nice. I was actually attending this championship, and I won't get into how well I did in this video. At least I didn't do great, unfortunately, but I have lots of things to say based on my experience there, and I think that that also translates into this video. However, at the tournament, you were able to buy these exclusive sleeves. Now, as I know that my audience is quite global, I wanted to choose something that's actually usable even if you play in a different language. This giveaway will be going on from today, October 13th, until midnight of October 21st, Japan Standard Time. To enter the giveaway, you must be subscribed and leave a comment, and also like if you enjoy the content, on videos that are posted within this time frame. I will choose a random commenter from one of these videos as the winner of this giveaway and contact you. If you are the lucky winner, I'll announce it in a video and let you know how to contact me so I can get these sleeves to you. I hope that you guys enjoy this. I know it's not much, but it is kind of cool, isn't it? Now, this championship was a 3v3 championship, which means that you're going to see a bit more variety in the decks than you might in a 1v1 tournament. There were 648 teams attending, and then, of course, of those, 16 made it to the top cut. These are the decks that made it into the top cut. Now, as we can see, of the 16 teams, 14 of them are using Blue Doflamingo. Blue Doflamingo is by far the strongest deck in the format right now, so really what we're looking at is what do you use aside from Blue Doflamingo. Nonetheless, there are two teams that made it to the top 16 without Blue Doflamingo, which is very interesting. The second most common deck in top cut was Black Lucci. Now, I've been talking about Black Lucci here and there in my last couple of videos about the meta and how it's evolving in Japan, and I think that it's mainly that Black Lucci is very inconsistent. Now, even within my team, we were discussing that perhaps if Black Lucci can consistently get all of the cards he needs, he is by far the strongest deck. The one thing that gates the deck is the consistency. In a 3v3 tournament, even if you have these kinds of inconsistent games where you low roll, don't get the cards that you need, you still have two people next to you that can save it in the event that you end up losing. For this kind of 3v3 tournament, decks like Lucci can be very powerful, and as such, it is the second most represented deck. Now, looking at the third most represented deck, we actually have three decks: Black Yellow Luffy, Bonney, and Black Teach. Now, Black Yellow Luffy and Bonney have been on the rise recently. Black Yellow Luffy, of course, if you're in the Western format, will be very familiar with his power. He has an excellent matchup into mono-black decks, and has a very solid matchup all around into many decks, the one neck being, of course, Green Bonney. Black Yellow Luffy, although I wouldn't say has a great matchup into Blue Doflamingo, if he can do well into most of the other decks and not instantly lose against Blue Doflamingo, he's definitely still a very good choice in the OP09 meta. Green Bonney, on the other hand, actually has a slightly winning matchup into Doflamingo in my, as well as our team's opinion. The reason for this is because the 5-cost carrot and just being able to stall the game with your leader ability to eventually close out the game with cards like 8-cost Kid or 10-cost Doflamingo just helps stall the game long enough that you can eventually take the board back and push back to win the game. As such, Bonney, although she loses to mono-black decks, you only have a 1 in 3 chance of hitting a mono-black deck. As such, for these kinds of 3v3 tournaments, and even many 1v1 tournaments, she's going to be a very good choice regardless. The last deck with 6 people representing it is Black Teach. Now, I talked in my last video about how Black Teach was coming up slightly recently, but it's much more noticeable here, where there's 6 of them. People were talking about it here and there as a potential deck choice, but 6 actually making it to the top 16 is pretty significant given the actual play rate of the deck. Now, Teach is very unique in that he actually has an abysmal, like, almost auto-lose Blue Doflamingo matchup. But on the other hand, he has an almost auto-win matchup into many of the meta decks. Black Lucci can't use his Moria, Black Yellow Luffy can't use his Moria, Bonney can't use his Doflamingo, 8-Kid gets nullified by 10-cost Teach, Enel doesn't have a leader ability. There's just so many decks that Teach can just destroy. Another important factor to Teach is that people just aren't really used to playing against Teach. Many people just forget that you can't use on-play effects and will play a card and then realize after it's a vanilla. I believe that these sorts of things have added up to make Teach very strong, and especially in this format where you only have a 1 in 3 chance of hitting Doflamingo, as well as if you do end up hitting Doflamingo, it's still not over due to the nature of the format. Teach was probably the best poised deck in the meta for this 3v3 in my opinion. After that, we have a pretty significant fall off in deck representation, but we have 2 Red Purple Luffy, 2 Purple Luffy, and 2 NL. Now, I know how hard I preached Red Purple Luffy in the beginning of the meta, and I think that the meta has changed a bit, unfortunately. And due to Red Purple Luffy's poor Black Lucci as well as Bonney matchup, I personally wasn't rating Red Purple Luffy that high, but nonetheless, 2 people still made it into top 16, so it's definitely still a strong deck. Purple Luffy may surprise some people with how low his representation is, but with the advent of things like Black Lucci and Bonney rising in priority, Bonney, for example, basically doesn't lose to Purple Luffy due to the fact that she runs 8-cost Kid now. 8-cost Kid alone just makes it way too hard for Purple Luffy to actually finish the game, unless he starts spamming 9-cost Luffys with Rush to be able to push through that wall as fast as possible. As such, Purple Luffy's priority has come down a little bit, while these other decks like Bonney and Lucci have come up, but still we can see decks like the King of Cope, Yellow NL, still making it into the top 16. NL's biggest strength as a deck is that he actually has a reasonably winning matchup into Doflamingo, and that's probably it. He does quite poorly into Lucci or Bonney. These decks tend to run over him, even Teach that's coming up. So definitely right now in OP09, NL's more of a meme with a dream, but in these kinds of 3v3 tournaments, anything is possible. You can technically hit 9 Doflamingos in a row. Lastly, our one-of decks. We have Red Shanks, Green Yellow Yamato, and Purple Black Luffy. Now I'll say flat out, I could not find any of their deck lists. They did not post their deck lists, so I can't actually show anything that they had or talk about the sort of adaptations that they made, which is unfortunate, but just know that there was 1 Shanks, which was surprising because I thought there'd be more, 1 Yamato, which, I don't know, it's a miracle, and 1 Purple Black Luffy, which I was considering as an option, and actually many top players were considering as an option for their third deck as well. Let's look at the ones that won. Now, the winning team is called Huiza Hyoko no Daibouken, and they ran Bonney, Lucci, and Doflamingo. Bonney right now has a bit of a debate of whether you go full Supernovas or Supernovas plus the Don Quixote family. Now, the benefit of going to Don Quixote family is that you can search for the 10-cost Doflamingo. The benefit, of course, of going Supernova is that you don't need to put in these weaker Don Quixote family cards into your deck and just make the Supernova and 8-cost Kid package as strong as possible. Now, I personally like running 2 searchers just because the way that I used to play Bonney was to just annoy the opponent by playing 2 searchers at the same time, resting at the same time, and then being like, oh, what are you going to do with 1 Donga? The winning list is also in this style. The one thing that I find curious about this list is that it only runs 3 10-cost Doflamingo. I don't think that this is necessarily a bad thing, but I do think that it's a bit counterintuitive if you're also running the Baby 5 to search for it, if you're only running 3 of it. Of course, that means that it makes it easier to find, but it also makes it harder to find a second one. If you just want to find one of them, which seems like it's the way that this deck's trying to play just by looking at the deck list, then you can just play 4 Doflamingo and then just not run the Baby 5, and then you have a reasonable chance of drawing into it. The reason that you played Baby 5 is so that you can play more than 1 each game. Nonetheless, though, of course, he ended up winning the tournament, so he has the right answer. 1-cost fetch has been coming up recently as it's become stronger with Red Purple Law being banned, as there aren't many great ways to get rid of 1-cost cards at the moment. The reason that Hawkins and Hody have been coming down in priority is not necessarily because the effects are weak, but rather just that 8-cost Kid, 9-cost Shanks, and 10-cost Doflamingo are extremely strong in the meta. If you end up running 4 of each, or even 4-3-4, 4-3-3 like in this list, you're going to need to lower these other ratios like Hawkins and Hody to make sure that you don't just brick every single game. As such, this deck is also running 4 of the 0-cost event to just make sure he's never in that scenario. In seat 2, we have Lucci. Now, Lucci's list is quite standard, except for the fact that it runs Hina. Now, anyone who used to play against or as Sakazuki will remember how terrifying Hina is, and recently it's been coming back as a card that can reach higher thresholds when you're KOing things, as of course with the loss of NES Lobby, it's become a bit harder to reach these higher thresholds. This is almost exactly the same as the Lucci list that our team was thinking about bringing, so it's great to see that we were on the right track. But other than that, this is a very standard Lucci list for what you will see in Japan, and is a very good template to go off if you are curious about what you should do with your Lucci list. Some people are running the 9-cost Stussy, and this is okay if you're going against things like Shanks, but as the priority right now is to find a way to deal with Doflamingo, Stussy just is much too slow to fight Doflamingo, and as such people are tending to take it out in favor of things like Kaku, which with your leader effect can KO at 4-cost, or things like Hina and Brook that can help you take smaller things and develop your own board. Lastly, in seat 3 is Doflamingo. Now Doflamingo has way too many different versions of Doflamingo right now. I will go into this in my Doflamingo guide that should be coming out either tomorrow or the day after. Not sure yet. I've recorded most of it. But this is what I would classify a more aggro-focused Doflamingo. There are more types of Doflamingo that are more control-focused or mid-range focused, but this sort of aggro Doflamingo tries to aim to finish the game in about 5 turns, and focuses on the pure consistency in early game with things like 1-cost Perona, 2-cost Teach to just push as much power into the opponent as possible from the early stages to not let the opponent have an answer. The one interesting card that this deck runs is Gravity Blade. Now Gravity Blade has been seeing some more play just due to the fact that Bonney has been coming up more recently. If Bonney ends up playing things like Carrot or Hawkins, it's quite difficult to play these cards, especially if they start playing 2, 2, and Gravity Blade can just help you take both of them out immediately. If you don't have Gravity Blade in your deck, then you probably will end up losing to Bonney, and if you have it, then you have a much better chance at beating Bonney, of course, although it doesn't reach the 8-cost skid threshold. Moving on to the second place team is Techamingo. Now, compared to Fuizahyugon Daiboken, Techamingo actually only shares one deck, and that is of course Doflamingo. But the other two decks are different, which I think is the first time that we've ever had that in a 3v3 tournament. But what made this 3v3 so hard was that there was one established best deck, and so many decks to choose from for your second and third deck. In the first seat, we have Black Yellow Luffy. Now, Black Yellow Luffy's deck is very much solved. People have basically been playing the same template of Black Yellow Luffy for the past half a year. But recently, in North America, Europe, Southeast Asia, for example, people have been running the 4-cost Kuzan. As he runs it at 2, it's hard to say that it's part of his game plan, but if in the event that he runs against something like a Bonney, it definitely helps in that matchup, and as there are more Bonnies in this meta, it's definitely a reasonable choice. I don't know if you really need 3-cost Iwankofu now that you don't have Red Purple on the meta, but of course you can keep it in mind as it was in fact the winner and ended up beating Bonney in the finals. More importantly, I want to look at Doflamingo. Now, when I talked about there being multiple types of Doflamingo, this is another type of Doflamingo. This is the more mid-rangey version of Doflamingo. Now, the key difference between this Doflamingo compared to the Doflamingo that I showed before was that this runs the 6-cost Joseph. I talked about this card as well as uploaded a video of me using it in a game against Fidelity TCG, and I think it's a very good addition to the deck. Now, if you're more focused on this aggro plan, of course you won't have a timing to play Joseph, but if you're trying to control the board through means of 4-cost Law or 6-cost Joseph, just having more cards that can bounce the board as well as also bounce your own board is very strong. One of the strengths of Doflamingo is that he can play these 1-costs, get a reasonable effect out of them, and then bounce them back to hand to reuse them for their effect or even for counter. In this way, Doflamingo effectively never runs out of hand, as every single card that he plays will either literally draw a card from his deck or technically draw a card by bouncing it back to his hand. The third deck, and actually the one that was the biggest surprise to our team, was Purple Luffy. Now, Purple Luffy, in our opinion, hasn't been doing that great recently, just due to the fact that there are many decks that have come up that can beat it, like Bonney. Regardless, this is an extremely standard Purple Luffy. Like, it's almost as template as it gets, except that instead of the 5-cost Queen, it runs the 5-cost Kid. Now, 5-cost Kid is effectively only good on the second turn when you're going second, as you play 5-cost Kid, and then on the next turn you can play Dofitaro, to not have to use your leader ability another time to play the 9-cost Luffy. However, it's possible that this one adaptation actually significantly increases the power of the deck, as you don't need to use your leader ability multiple times, and 9-cost Luffy in general is just so strong. While people generally weren't using this 5-cost Kid due to this really small window where he's actually usable, this player runs 4, I guess, just in the event that he is given second. Purple Luffy's thing is that if he goes first, he's one of the strongest decks in the game, and if he goes second, he's pretty bad. His difference between going first and second is extremely significant in many matchups, where there has to be a big asterisk, where Doflamingo matchup, if you go first, you're winning. If you go second, you're losing. Teach matchup, if you go first, you're winning. If you go second, it's harder. There are many matchups where Purple Luffy needs to go first to actually have a winning chance, which is why we ended up not electing it for our 3v3 team. However, I guess if you run 5-cost Sid, perhaps making your turns going second much stronger and being able to consistently play 9-cost Luffy with potentially 3 life remaining is strong enough for you to actually be able to win the matchup that you tend to be losing when you're going second. The 7-cost Sanji is also used in the event that you don't draw Dofitaro. Of course, although it's small, there is a chance that you end up not drawing the Dofitaro, which means that you completely ruined your 7 or 8 turn going first or second. As such, Sanji just helps to increase the consistency of this plan to hopefully be able to stabilize into the late game where you're going to eventually try to finish out the game with 9-cost Luffy. Now, as I mentioned before with Bonney, that there are 2 different versions of the deck, one running Baby 5 and Bonney, and one exclusively running Bonney. This is a deck that made it into the top 16 that exclusively runs Bonney in this Supernova package. Now, it still runs the same core of 9-cost Shanks, 10-cost Doflamingo, and 8-cost Kid, but it doesn't run the 1-cost Baby 5, so that you can search for the 10-cost Doflamingo and instead relies on just drawing it naturally. Now, 9-cost Shanks and 10-cost Doflamingo do slightly similar things, and as you have these 6 cards that are slightly similar in effect, there's a reasonably high chance you can actually draw the cards that you need. As such, this is another deck that made it into top 16, and I thought I should point it out, as of course it is a perfectly viable and very winning option. Thankfully, the player Daoka posted his match history, and we see that he lost 3 times to Shanks, which is a very hard matchup, and then 1 time to the SD14 Black Luffy. He luckily dodged Lucci through all of his matchups, but Shanks and Mono Black are the hardest matchups for this deck, and as such we can see that he's been very consistent in losing against these bad matchups and winning against everything else. Now actually, there's a third type of Bonney. Now, I've talked about running 10-cost Doflamingo in decks that don't run Baby 5 and decks that do run Baby 5, but what about just not running 10-cost Doflamingo at all? Now this deck runs the very strong classic cards such as 6-cost Hawkins and 7-cost Hody at the max 4 copies, and instead does not run the 10-cost Doflamingo. As such, he has more consistency in this mid-game plan, and then we can see from his list is very focused on finishing the game through 8-cost Kid. This deck runs 9 blockers that are 3 cost or less for the 8-cost Kid effect, and as well as cards like Shanks that can help get rid of these larger things. This deck is generally well-rounded to be able to deal with these smaller decks as well as larger decks through these 2 cards. Nonetheless, these 3 decks are the general sort of template for Bonney, and none of them necessarily seem to be the wrong answer, as of course all 3 of them managed to get into the top 16. Now another list that I want to talk about is Chami's list. Now, Chami is actually a card shop owner in Tokyo. He's a really nice guy. I've met him many times. But he made it to the top 4 using Black Yellow Luffy. This Black Yellow Luffy list is actually very similar to the one that ended up winning, only 2 cards off. Now, this deck also runs 3-cost Ivankov, so maybe I am missing something about how it's used in this meta. But nonetheless, the more interesting card here is that it's running the 5-cost promo Sable. Now, this 5-cost Sable not only is a 2000 counter that is searchable, as it's named Sable, it can also act in an emergency as an extra 5-cost Luffy, as it can help you draw your life. As such, you don't need to have exclusively Luffy on the board to be able to manipulate your life. Sable helps act as more consistency in this regard, I imagine. Nonetheless, the promo pops up here and there, and there's just a debate of whether or not it's worth running over cards like Makino, and as we can see in Chami's interpretation, he does not run Makino, and instead runs the 5-cost Sable. Now, before we get into the final deck, I wanted to just go over Red Purple Luffy because I really like the deck myself. We have the match history of one of the Red Purple Luffy players, but unfortunately he didn't post his list. But nonetheless, we can see the sort of things that he was hitting as well as what he was winning against. We can see that this Red Purple Luffy actually beat 3 Lucci, which is generally considered a slightly hard matchup. He thankfully dodged Bonney, which I think is the hardest matchup for Red Purple Luffy. Nonetheless, he only lost 1 game in his entire game day, and that was against Purple Luffy. He went 10-1 overall, showing that there's definitely still something to this deck, and people who really want to play this deck, I recommend you to keep trying. After seeing this, I will definitely give another thought to Red Purple Luffy. I just wish that he showed a list. Now, the final list that we're going to be talking about in this video is one that was really causing a storm this tournament, and that is Black Teach. Now, Black Teach has been slowly being solved over time, and generally just playing the standard Blackbeard Pirates package is very strong. However, what you supplement to that package is what really makes a difference in this game. This is the Teach that got top 4 in the 3v3 championship of 1,944 players. This Teach runs Manshiri and Bartolomeo. Manshiri was a card that people have been talking about ever since the release of Teach as a card that can be used as its, of course, activate main that can help you refuel your hand. Of course, the demerit of this is that it returns 2 cards to the bottom of your deck, which makes your Jesus Spa just weaker. Nonetheless, this deck runs 4 Manshiri as well as 4 Bartolomeo, which you generally don't see. Now, I talked to a couple of Teach players that are around me, and they generally don't like running more than 8 2000 counters, but this deck is running 12, as well as ways to recur the resources. Although it's not exactly this list, the people who used this deck in the championship actually posted a video yesterday using a similar version of this list, so I will link that in the comments just so you guys can watch that too, because it is very interesting. The idea when you play Teach is to be able to control the board long enough to be able to play your 10-cost Teach securely. This is kind of similar to the way that Red Shanks wants to play, except that Black Teach has a very opposite way of playing the game, where Red Shanks survives by just having a very strong guard. Black Teach survives by clearing the board with a comparatively really weak guard. When Teach uses leader effect, he has to trash a card, but in turn the opponent can't use any unplay effects the next turn. This can be really significant for some decks. For example, if you run Moria, who could basically do everything, now is just an 8-cost 9000 vanilla. Manshiri and Nafito like both technically rest 1 dome to search for a card, and as such, if you can find good timings to be able to rest these at the same time, the opponent is forced to hit them instead of your life, which just gives you more time to eventually start chaining your 10-cost Teach. I can definitely sense by seeing this list that it's trying its best to be able to deal with Doflamingo, and actually looking at his match history, we can see that he only hit 1 Doflamingo and still ended up losing. Now, even though this core Blackbeard Pirates package seems to be quite solid, there's still lots of room even within this package for what you use and you don't use. This other deck list that also came into the top 4 uses the Stage. Not only this, but he's also using just 1 of the 2-cost blocker in the Blackbeard Pirates package, as well as 2 Jack. Now, Jack, of course, is a reasonable way to filter your hand, fill your trash, and to be able to KO smaller things with things such as Ice Age, which this deck is running as well. And it's been in the talks as a potential card to be used alongside things like 9-cost Kaido. There's actually a 9-cost Kaido list that also did well, just not this well, so this is the one that I'm going to be showcasing. Nonetheless, even within Teach lists, there's still lots of room for improvement and lots of debate over what cards will actually be in the final list. It's going to be very interesting to see which one of these lists actually ends up being the correct answer, and of course I'll be covering this as we go. This seems like one of the sets that we won't actually end up solving evolving like we have in the other sets, it'll be very interesting to see how the decks evolve, and of course I'll be here with you to show you them. Now once again, to remind you, I am running a giveaway on this video as well as the next coming couple of videos, so make sure to subscribe, like, comment, the most important things if you actually liked the video, to let me know what you thought about it. Nonetheless, I hope that you guys enjoy this content, and I will see you guys next time. Bye bye.